Hi there, welcome to History of Thought 2, and today is our second thinker in terms of kind of the foundations of queer theory. We talked about Foucault and the history of sexuality last time, and then today we're going to talk about Judith Butler, who is probably really the foundational thinker of queer theory starting in the 1980s until present day, who also draws a lot on Foucault's history of sexuality. So if you didn't listen to that lecture, I would highly recommend that you go back and listen to that one before you hear about Judith Butler. So you actually have a selection from Judith Butler's 1990 book, Gender Trouble, that was assigned today, but you also have an excerpt from a more recent book called Queer, A Graphic History, the section on Foucault and Butler. And so it really talks about how their ideas, and I think with visuals and very accessible language, how their ideas, what their ideas are and how they relate to each other. I also highly recommend, which is on the course website, that you view Judith Butler's Gender Trouble Explained with Cats, which is a great comic and funny and easy to understand, I think, a lot easier than Judith Butler's writing. So, kind of what Foucault did for sexuality, which is kind of sort of start to really look at the way that we talk about sexuality and kind of deconstruct this idea of sexuality being innate to who we are and being sort of biological, that Judith Butler is sort of performing similar maneuvers as Foucault, but with the idea of gender. So different topic, but very much interrelated. When I do this class live, we actually start out talking about what actually is gender. So maybe spend a minute thinking about it. It's such a simple question, but, what is gender? And even more importantly, this will come up later when we talk about Judith Butler. What did you do today that helped construct and reinforce your gender identity and the gender identity that you sort of perform or display to the world? I'm trying to think of all the things I did. I put on some lip gloss and some concealer under my dark bags under my eyes. And I styled my hair in a particular way, that's worn. I guess my hair is kind of short, but worn at a length that would be read as a certain kind of gender identity, right? I, carry myself and walk a certain way. I wear certain kinds of clothes, all of these different things that you do every single day over and over again that in a way helps construct and reinforce, but sometimes subvert. And that's something that Judith Butler would want us to engage in, our gender identity. Both, we could say the gender identity in terms of the gender at which society reads us at, and second, how we choose to fashion our own gender identity and display. So, the fact, a lot of people would kind of say, well, the core idea of Judith Butler's gender is socially constructed. I mean, kind of, but it's more about how that process happens. It's not a radical idea today, but a critical site of politics and activism. But really what Butler is saying, how does this process of doing gender, of sort of constructing and always sort of reconstructing and reinforcing gender identity over and over, how does that process actually happen? And what are its implications? And how do we sort of disrupt normative understandings of gender from Butler's perspective? And that's also, there's very much an activist component to what she's saying. So let's see if you can see me there. So Judith Butler, who's still alive, she was born in 1956, is an American philosopher whose work has influenced feminist theory, queer studies, political philosophy, ethics, and literary theory. She was born in Ohio to a Jewish family, and she says that courses she took as a teenager in the Hebrew school that she went to in Jewish ethics began her lifelong passion for philosophy. And she's written not just about issues of gender, but all sorts of other kinds of philosophical issues. The last I looked into it, she splits her time between Berkeley and Columbia, and she is heavily influenced by Foucault. We can see Foucault looming over her, especially in her writings on gender, Foucault's history of sexuality. So one of the things that she's attempting to engage in is not just kind of deconstructing the notion of gender, but deconstructing the idea of sex and bodies. So that's fine. As Butler has said, one is not simply a body. So we don't just exist as a body. This would be sort of an essentialist notion of identity. But in some very key sense, one does one's body. And indeed, one does one's body differently from one's contemporaries and from one's embodied predecessors and successors as well. So what does this mean? So the body is often seen as something passive and this kind of, quote, natural medium through which culture and society imprints itself. But, think a little bit, we brainstorm in class about this, but I'll just have to brainstorm for you. What is a, quote, natural body? What does that even mean? What would constitute it? We could kind of just think of like a body, a human body without any sort of clothing or jewelry or products or anything. But even that has been culturally, medically, technologically mediated, shaped, and altered since birth. I mean, just thinking about my own body, chemical alterations, right? Vaccines since the time we were babies, I hope, all of the medicines that we take. I mean, I pop a bunch of ibuprofen. All of the drugs, both prescribed and illicit, that we've put into them. Think about normative conceptions of body size and shape. What does a natural body look like in terms of its size or shape? Now, obviously, I'm not asking for, like, quote, the truth, but how society conceives of that and sort of naturalizes it, normalizes it. Think about normative conceptions of hair, hygiene, self-care, right? What about body art? What about tattooing? What about piercing? Scarring, all of those kinds of things that we do to decorate our body. Is that somehow unnatural? Surgical alterations, cosmetic, medically necessary. And right, there's a judgment too between how we divide those two. Technological apparatuses, right? Wearable tech. I mean, now we all have, our cell phones practically glued to our sides, but what about when they get embedded in our arms or just embedded in our brain? That's going to happen pretty soon. Pregnancy. When does my body end and the body of the fetus begin? And as somebody who's been pregnant, it's a really weird experience. And what about kind of the mind-body distinction? This is a very old distinction in philosophy. We didn't talk about Descartes here, but in Western philosophy and the Enlightenment, you kind of have this very distinct notion that there's a difference between the mind and the body. Obviously, like religious conceptions of the soul and afterlife create this distinction that the mind or the soul is somehow separate from the body. But, think about all the different variations of how we could conceive of that, right? So again, I ask, what is a natural body? Independent of all of this, could we even imagine it? And all of the various ways that we have altered our bodies since birth. And what would a body look like? A purely biological body divorced from culture. I mean, is that even possible? Do you look at the outside or inside? What do you look for? This is something Butler will push us towards. What needs to be there to be, quote, female or, quote, male? What can be missing and still sort of gendered in a certain way? And how is this all overladen with existing cultural knowledge and assumptions? Right. So, it seems like kind of this natural issue, right? This distinction. And in feminism, right, for a long time, and this is with sort of second wave feminism like Simone de Beauvoir, it's kind of this dichotomy of nature culture, right? That there's this distinction between sex and gender. So that gender is what is socially constructed, right? Masculinity and femininity. But sex, male-female, is biological. And that was actually sort of, the way of looking things in feminism for a long time. And, Simone de Beauvoir's one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman, right? That was radical at the time. And it's still very radical that gender is socially constructed. But we still sort of cling to a biological essentialism at the core, that there's certain kinds of ideas about what certain bodies can look like, and that it's a very gendered notion of what bodies can look like. But when you start kind of poking at this nature culture dichotomy, it really starts to unravel. And we talked about this last time a little bit with Foucault, but why is it that in our society currently we value and hold higher what is seen as natural, biological, or innate, right? Even our conceptions of natural are laden with cultural, meanings. I mean, think of like, the natural food movement or the natural medicine movement or all of this kind of stuff, supplements and all that whole, the wellness industry is sort of based on this idea of natural, but it's a very culturally mediated understanding, right? And why should nature be privileged? Why is it somehow better? So what Butler is trying to do is deconstruct kind of essentialist notions of identity that are still clinging to the way that we look at gender and sex. So Foucault's point that we ended the history of sexuality with is that sexuality is as a central and fixed part of our identity is a relatively modern construct, that people engaged in lots of different acts and had lots of different desires over human history, right? Absolutely. And that people were often punished and repressed for engaging in certain kinds of acts and acting on certain kinds of desires that were prohibited. But the notion of sort of sexuality as being an innate part of our desire, of who we are as an individuals, it's a biological notion, part of who we are, and it's central to our identity. Foucault is saying that's new. So even the notion of having some kind of stable, pre-cultural, innate aspect to our identity, be it sexuality or anything else, is questioned by Foucault. And this is what Butler's drawing on in her discussion of gender. So Butler is also troubling notions of individual essentialist identity, So for Foucault, he's troubling why is how what you sexually desire a central part of who you are in our society. And Butler is troubling sort of essentialist notions of, why is sort of this certain configuration of body parts and acts and behaviors and, a central part of what we call gender in our society, and trying to deconstruct that. And again, this goes back to the idea that identity, this notion of the coherent self, is produced through a certain culture. It's not some sort of, it's a performance. It's not a reflection of some sort of true inner self. That there's really, for thinkers like Foucault, like Butler, there's no essential interior authentic self that somehow precedes culture, that somehow precedes, the internalization of the gaze, right? So what does this mean for notions of essential identity? So if it's considered biologically, innate and given, is it somehow seen as more legitimate? And what are the politics of disrupting a biological or innate notion of sexual orientation and gender identity? And, these are all really important questions. We touched on some when we talked about Foucault. And also we touched on this a little bit, but how do we respect and not do violence to individuals whose personal narratives are connected to essentialist notions of identity? So how can we both engage in the important critical work that Foucault and Butler are doing of sort of deconstructing and de-essentializing concepts like sexuality and gender, while also respecting stories of individuals? Think about, the narrative, the personal story of a trans person. I was born this way. I always felt I was living in the wrong body, which has a very sort of essentialism at its core. So how do you both sort of engage in the philosophical work of deconstructing essentialism, but also respecting essentialism in the core sort of self-narrative of especially of marginalized peoples? And that's a really tough kind of thing to navigate, because you could see how Foucault and Butler deconstructing some of these things could easily mean, well, then we can fix them and make people not queer, right? Which is bad. And I talked a little bit last time about strategic essentialism, the notion that even if sort of philosophically we all agree with Foucault and Butler, and maybe we don't, that's fine, but even if you do, that you can sort of see the strategic value of essentialist ideas about sexuality and gender if it helps sort of create more freedom and more liberation for people. So, in Gender Trouble, which you read a selection from. So we're kind of moving on to what Butler actually says how gender kind of becomes socialized. So it's her very specific model of how gender sort of gets constructed as part of ourself, through that sort of disciplinary powers, through that internalized gaze that we are constantly always a part of from the day that we're born. So Butler states, it is no longer clear that feminist theory ought to try to settle the questions of primary identity in order to get on with the task of politics. So, and this was actually one of your readings questions. What is the problem of the primary identity of woman that Butler sees as a central failure of Western feminism, and even of feminist thinkers like de Beauvoir? So Butler is saying the very category of woman around which feminist politics is centered is a social construction. Right. And we've talked about this too. A lot of times feminist politics in the West has very much kind of elevated a certain kind of woman, right? Sort of middle class, white, cisgendered, straight female politics. But, so even if we can all agree that sort of the category of woman is a construct, and there's as many different ways of sort of inhabiting the idea of woman as there are individual people who identify as women, how can you have a feminist politics without the category of woman? I mean, don't you need defined bodies of woman, even if broadly defined, even if we define trans women in the category, which good modern feminists will? Don't you need like these defined bodies of women for feminism to make sense? And Butler would say, no, that's been the problem with feminism, that we keep trying to define, sort of this category of woman. And actually that the sort of job of feminism is to destabilize that category. So how does Butler go about destabilizing this idea of sort of the primary identity? So her big idea in 3 words is gender is performative. Gender is performative. That the gendered body has no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute its reality. So ontological is about sort of what exists. So she's saying that the gendered body has no existence apart from the various acts which constitute its reality. So performativity first is not the same as performance, which is often a conscious choice and is seen as playing a role, right? So if you're performing something, you can easily stop performing. It's pretend, it's sort of playing dress up. Performativity for Butler is about what's called citational repetitions. So it's our everyday actions that reproduce gender. And these are important. The way we act, the way we talk, what we wear, how we gesture, what we put on, what we take off our bodies, all of these kinds of things, it's not like we are this gender, therefore we engage in these acts. It's engaging in these acts over and over again throughout our lives constitutes and constructs our gender. There's also larger cultural acts and routines that are part of that system of disciplinary power about gender that we internalize and we turn that gaze inward. Bathroom signs, dominant use of gender pronouns, right? He, she, his, hers, normative understandings of gender circulating in media, institutional and informative practices of coercion and violence, right? Psychiatry, bullying. So by endlessly citing and speaking the conventions and norms of the social world around us, we help enact this reality. We create reality. It's not like a reality exists and we conform to it. We are actively creating this reality, constructing it every day through our own acts, as well as through sort of how disciplinary power works on us and how we internalize the gaze of sort of gendered bathrooms, for example, by actually picking a bathroom and walking into it. We're sort of reproducing and helping to sort of reconstruct gender and the idea of gender. Butler focuses especially on speech acts. She gets this from a guy named J.L. Austin, which I'm not going to go much into in this class, but you can look him up if you want to. But she, along with other theorists, contend, like J.L. Austin, contend that speech acts produce what they name. So, I now pronounce you man and wife, or it's a boy. For them, the speech act itself of saying it's a boy or it's a girl is what constructs the very idea of girl and boy. That there isn't some sort of essentialist idea of girl or boy that exists prior to us creating it through these speech acts. But that they are constantly created and recreated and reinforced over and over and over these things. Think about like the popularity of like these baby reveal parties, where somebody cuts into a cake and like pink or blue confetti pops out or something like that. I don't know. And how much importance we also place in that, right? That it constitutes such a strong part of our identity. And, through that revelation, we're helping to sort of reconstruct and reinforce gender. And again, this is connected to Foucault, how power is connected to knowledge, labeling, defining, describing, categorizing at all of these microsites, right? Like everyday sites of gender performativity, right? At the baby gender reveal party is one of these microsites of power. So again, remember, performativity is not the same as performance, which is kind of a bad reading of Butler. It's often a conscious choice. A performance is a conscious choice, right? It's seen as playing a role. But the conscious performance of disruptive sort of citations of gender can help reveal its artifice. And we'll discuss this later with drag. Yeah, hold on a second, you guys. So if gender is performative, how do we disrupt gender and gender norms? And this is something that Foucault isn't really as good looking at, like sort of disrupting these instances of disciplinary power, but Butler is really interested in this. So individual resistance to gender norms in our daily lives is something that Butler really places emphasis on. So if gender is socially constructed and power is connected to knowledge, then, can't we just simply give up the farce? Can't we all just create new categories, definitions, labels, descriptions beyond binary conceptions of gender? I mean, in some ways, this is like another bad reading of Butler. It's like, oh, this is all socially constructed. Then we can just kind of all wake up and decide, oh, let's give up gender, or the way that we have sort of constructed gender in our society. Judith Butler did an interview with the magazine Artform about 2 years after this book came out, about A Gender Trouble came out in 1992. And she actually complains about this reading. Butler complains that people have misread Gender Trouble. She says, quote, "The bad reading goes something like this. I can get up in the morning, look in my closet, and decide which gender I want to be today. I can take out a piece of clothing and change my gender, stylize it, and then that evening I can change it again and be something radically other, so that what you get is something like the commodification of gender and the understanding of taking on gender as a kind of consumerism. Treating gender deliberately as if it's an object out there, when my whole point was that the very formation of subjects, the very formation of persons presupposes gender in a certain way, that gender is not to be chosen, and that performativity is not radical choice, and it's not volunteerism. Performativity has to do with repetition, very often the repetition of oppressive and painful gender norms. This is not freedom, but a question of how to work the trap that one is inevitably in." Right? So, it's not easy because, like Foucault is talking about in terms of sexuality, this notion of sexuality being so central to our identity, and this sort of this contemporary view of sexuality being so innate to who we are. Gender is as well, right? And that's not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? It's just, I think, Butler would say it's a bad thing and we should transform it. But it is so embedded in how we create ourselves as people and as subjects that it is almost painful to divorce oneself from it. And I think this is true. I mean, this is hard for me to talk about because I'm a cisgendered woman, but I think for individuals who would maybe identify as trans, or individuals who are genderqueer or sort of have identities that don't fit sort of the neat binary. There's an important sort of subversive work that Butler would point out is very important that's being done by individuals sort of resisting that. But even identities that are sort of pushing against the binary are still very much wrapped up in a notion of gender as being something that exists. And that, maybe we're adding categories to it. Maybe we add sort of gender queer, maybe we add the ability of people to sort of move along a spectrum of gender, right? And can sort of perform gender differently or sort of in sort of change their gender. But much like what Foucault is talking about, that we're still, even if we're more sort of liberated in terms of what's considered, quote, normal in sexuality, we're still stuck to these old notions of sexuality being this essential thing that is central to who we are and our identity, that, that Butler would say, that even a lot of, more, let's say, liberatory views of gender and liberatory gender identities, we're still very much stuck in this idea that gender is this thing that's essential to who we are as people, and that we have to label and categorize it. And even if those labels and categories are less oppressive, right, that those labels and categories are still very much about this essentialist notion of the self. And it's not easy to break out of those. It's not easy just to put on different clothes. And if you can, then that's an extreme privilege, right? For most people, this is, it's painful. And how do we get out of that? How do we work the trap that we're in? So Butler actually says that there can be resistance through art and through cultural production. And she looks specifically at drag. She looks at drag as parody, as gender performance. So I want to read a little section from Gender Trouble. I don't think this is in the section that you're assigned. I can't remember. But I'm just going to read you a little section. I have my giant Morton anthology of philosophy here, so I'm going to read from this. So Butler says, the notion of an original or primary gender identity is often parodied within the cultural practice of drag, cross-dressing, and the sexual stylization of butch femme identities. Within feminist theory, such parodic identities have been understood to be either degrading to women in the case of drag and cross-dressing, or an uncritical appropriation of sexual stereotypes from the practice of heterosexuality, especially in the case of butch femme lesbian identities. But the relationship between the imitation and the original is, I think, more complicated than that critique generally allows. Moreover, it gives a clue to the way in which the relationship between primary identification, that is, the original meaning accorded to gender, and subsequent gender experience might be reframed. The performance of drag plays upon the distinction between the anatomy of the performer and the gender that is being performed. But we are actually in the presence of three contingent dimensions of significant corporeality: an anatomical sex, gender identity, and gender performance. If the anatomy of the performer is already distinct from the gender of the performer, and both of those are distinct from the gender of the performance, then the performance suggests a dissonance, not only between sex and performance, but sex and gender and performance. As much as drag creates a unified picture of, quote, woman, which is what critics often oppose, it also reveals the distinctiveness of those aspects of gendered experience which are falsely naturalized as a unity through the regulatory fiction of heterosexual coherence. In imitating gender, drag implicitly reveals the imitative structure of gender itself, as well as its contingency. Indeed, part of the pleasure, the giddiness of the performance, is the recognition of a radical contingency in the relation between sex and gender in the face of cultural configurations of causal unities that are regularly assumed to be natural and necessary. In the place of the law of heterosexual coherence, we see sex and gender denaturalized by means of a performance which avows their distinctness and dramatizes the cultural mechanism of their fabricated unity. Okay, I know that's like a really hard reading, but what she's saying is, a lot of sort of earlier, some feminist critique of drag is, oh, look, you're just kind of reinforcing these stereotypes about femaleness and femininity and the idea of the woman. And what Butler is saying is no, that this is actually politically disruptive, that it sort of exposes the artifice of gender. by sort of taking on this sort of, this kind of hyped up version of femininity in the performance. And this is a performance, right? This is something, this is not performativity, this is performance. But this performance exposes that artifice that everybody who performs gender is engaging in. I don't know. I mean, we can talk about what you make of that, argument. And is that true for everyone? Like, who's gaining pleasure from watching drag and why? And are all people gaining pleasure for the same reason? Is drag actually is politically disruptive of gender norms, or is it reinscribing them, or both, and maybe for different audiences? Conscious performance of gender can sometimes be disruptive and reveal sort of this artifice, but it can also, as I said, reinscribe these stereotypes. And in that same interview with Artform, Judith Butler says, drag is subversive to the extent that it reflects on the imitative structure by which hegemonic gender is itself produced and disrupts heterosexuality's claim on naturalness and originality. I'm sorry, that's from her book, Bodies That Matter. But she writes in the Artform interview that it seems to me that there is no easy way whether to know something is subversive. Subversiveness is not something that can be gauged or calculated. I do think that for a copy to be subversive of heterosexual hegemony, it has to both mime and displace conventions. So one of the things we can talk about in class is, what are ways that we can sort of resist these hegemonic notions of gender and these kind of essentialist notions of gender that we're wedded to. Drag is kind of an interesting example, although it's an art form now that's been around a really long time and I think has transformed quite a bit. We can also look at, I think, some artistic examples. If anybody has some great sort of examples of contemporary art, either your own or somebody else that or, maybe some more famous artist that is kind of subverting and disrupting sort of normative notions of gender, then I think this is exactly what Butler's talking about, right? That there is definitely sovereign power involved here, and the state being able to say something like, you have to have gender neutral bathrooms, right? That's kind of the power of the sovereign. But there's also kind of this notion of disciplinary power can both kind of restrict individuals, right, in terms of creating these categories that we're stuck in and that we see as central to ourselves and essentialist. But it also gives us sort of the tools of the opportunity at these microsites to disrupt certain kinds of discursive systems, to disrupt certain kinds of ways of categorizing and labeling through our own acts, through our own sort of subversion of gender norms, through our own art, through our own practices. So I think that's something I think that's hopeful about Butler. And I think that's kind of a lot of the politics of disrupting gender that a lot of artists and activists are involved in contemporary times. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. So we will talk about queer theory and Foucault and Butler when we see each other next time. Bye.